So now we're going to turn to another way of looking at attack with a lens of how you can misuse attack in your security program. Our presenter, Kyle Rainey, spent years consulting in global enterprise incident response and forensic tasks for Fortune 500 companies, and as a security analyst at Red Canary, he helps lead the Security Operations Center's efforts to continuously develop and mature detection strategies. Please welcome Kyle Rainey.
Cool. Oh, there we go. Cool. So today we're going to be talking about some common pitfalls that my team and I have kind of observed over the past year and a half working with ATT&CK, and really looking at this from, we look at it from a detection and response perspective. So that's where we're coming from, and these are the pitfalls that we identified essentially when we went to operationalize ATT&CK a year and a half ago. A little bit about me really quick. We can just skip that really. Essentially, he did a great introduction. I've done incident response for a couple of years on a global team before coming to Red Canary, where I now help lead the detection strategies and detection engineering team to build new capabilities for our detection team. I'm also an avid snowboarder, and I teach children to snowboard at Breckenridge on the weekends. So moving into the talk. If we can get this to work, cool. So quick disclaimer, so I'm not going to be talking about how you shouldn't use ATT&CK. It's essentially things that we've identified that are traps. You may see them, you may have come across these. Essentially what we want to do is just bring that to the forefront, make sure everyone's aware of this, and kind of start a conversation how you can avoid them. And I'm going to share with you what we did to avoid these pitfalls, and kind of how we approach that. Because you absolutely should leverage ATT&CK. There's a lot of value in that. So the first pitfall I want to talk about is assuming that all techniques are equal. And what I really mean behind this is not necessarily each technique is equal to each other in terms of what they do, because techniques that fall under persistence tactics are completely different from those of discovery or the other tactics. What I really want to talk about is the scope and size of these within the language and the taxonomy of ATT&CK. You have some that are very specific. So for instance, watch agents, MSXSL, MS build, a lot of the ones that fall under execution persistence, they're very specific techniques that have a limited way that you can pretty much implement them in some cases. They're kind of broad there too as well. But it really drives for detection of these pretty simple, not simple, but it's easier to implement detection for these and handle false positives. The aspect here is as we go further and dive deeper into ATT&CK, as we went to map all of our detectors to this framework to kind of align with that, we started seeing things that were very broad. Things like PowerShell is a technique. PowerShell is just a programming language. You can do tons of things with this. To pick on it a little more, you can do almost every tactic with PowerShell if you want. So when we started mapping our detectors to this, we found that we had a ton that fell under PowerShell that also fell under a ton of other techniques, but it's a very broad scope there. So when you think about it from detection and measurement and coverage, it changes how you approach it. So my approach to detection of PowerShell really comes down to what are you doing with PowerShell? What are you doing with that broader technique, and how do you apply it with whatever data sources you are leveraging in your organization? And then we get even broader with some of the techniques that you'll find in ATT&CK. I don't want to pick on supply chain, but I like to pick on file deletion for this purpose, because that's essentially just a function of operating systems in general. Files get deleted. Files get deleted as a part of attack activity in destructive attacks and things like that. So it's valuable from that perspective. When you're looking at it from a response perspective, if I'm dealing with a destructive attack, I want to know what was deleted. It may be important there. So I may want that as context, but I may not create alerts for it or things like that. So you have to really apply that lens and understand that not everything will lead to detection or testability either as we go further. So I like to give away a takeaway for this. And essentially, my point was what we did was we focused on the most specific things first. So things that we knew we could implement detection for, specifically around alerting and creating events for our analysts. And then we added on to that using the threat model to add context to those. So we then tackled the broader ones. And then as we went through the broader ones, we applied more and more detection to those. So for instance, with PowerShell, we may have focused on like download cradles, and then we focused on obfuscation, or then we focused on like the next thing or the next thing. So we just kind of tackled it one piece at a time instead of trying to do this like broad brushstroke when we went to build detection for different things or map to different things. So I recommend focusing on what's specific to you first, and then increase your scope from there. The second pitfall I want to share with you that we identified was this concept of building an alert for every technique. We got this a lot from customers. Like, do you detect X? Do you detect Y? Do you detect this? Do you detect that? And like we detect quite a few things. But then as we got those questions about those more broad ones, it became imperative to share with our customers that knowledge of some of these are more applicable in terms of context. Some of these are even more applicable in terms of looking at them from a forensics perspective. So not everything falls into an alert because not every detection technique has to be an alert. Jack Crook is actually from GE, I believe. He's a great resource that I follow quite often, and he likes to talk about looking at things in clusters, clusters of detection techniques. So those more broad ones will lead you to, if you cluster them together, you might be able to generate an alert from there as well. So there's definitely ways you can do that. So I like to kind of bucket them like this. We have our alertable techniques, so ones that we can definitely build alerts for. They're easy to tune if you have the visibility in place and the systems in place to do that. And then you have things that are really important to add context to your events for your analysts. Otherwise, you will flood them. And when you flood them, they get angry. When they get angry, they run you out of the building. So essentially, things like file deletion, super important from a contextual perspective in the case of a destructive attack. Things like directory discovery, attackers enumerating your network. You want to know about it, but you may not want to alert on it because you have scripts that run across 100,000 systems that do this every day, every couple hours, and you'll just start generating events and events and events, and you'll just go through this like tuning rabbit hole. Forensics ones. So not every organization can look at their kernel modules and extensions. Not every organization can at scale look at bootkits and things like that. So those tend to come to light from my experience doing forensic investigation of deep dive things that get spawned from other incidents or other events that we're looking at. And essentially understanding where those fall in line helps you drive your detection strategy, prioritize what's important to you. And one point here, not everything, like Brian mentioned yesterday, about 75% of the attack framework is probably testable. The same thing applies to detection. Not everything is an alert. So again, focus on that, providing high fidelity detection, but also enrichment for your analysts so that they're spending less time tuning and churning and more time building more complex detection to tackle some of those harder problems that we all want to face. The third pitfall I want to cover is misunderstanding this concept of coverage. So we hear a lot about it, we talk a lot about it. It's what is your coverage? What do we cover? The leadership asks this question, and it really comes down to explaining what you have coverage for, but also the fact that I think Bryson just mentioned is like there's a limitless possibility of some of the techniques. So what you see is maybe you have a coverage map that's, this is just an example, that has a bunch of green squares and you have coverage for some of these cool things. But as you open the door to each technique, what you really see is that infinite universe of techniques. And behind each door is that universe. And you have to understand that you will build detection and you will have coverage for parts of it. And then you'll just, like a researcher will publish something on Twitter or whatever, and you'll discover something new and you'll go to add to your detection. It's a continuous addition and improvement. And the way we like to track it, and what I want to share with how we kind of do our measurement, we measure everything that we've implemented. So we capture metrics around each of our detector techniques, whether they're generating true positives, false positives, what category of detection that they're generating detections for, how much time analysts are spending on events for that specific detector, to help us kind of track, like, is it too broad or too hard to analyze? What can we add from an enrichment perspective to speed that up? Time for us is very important. We want to spend less time on false positives, more time on true positives, and more time building cool things. So the focus there is measure what you have. As you add stuff, include that in your measurements, but don't try to like go for the unknown. Don't try to measure an unknown, like limitless expanding kind of universe, and you'll get more value out of that. And then in terms of like how you share, changing your coverage gaps, as you add new things, inform your stakeholders. Hey, we added these new things. It closes this part of the gap, but we still have this other part of our gap that we have to work on next. And it really drives home that you're continuously improving, and that's the goal at the end of the day, to improve your security. The fourth one I like to share is staying in the matrix. So ATT&CK is great. It gives us that language we can talk to. I can talk to anybody on my team using this language. They'll understand it. I can probably explain it to my mom, maybe. But essentially, the point is, it's not all inclusive. It's very comprehensive. There's definitely things that fall outside of ATT&CK. There's things that will add to ATT&CK over time as this community grows. But the key thing here is here we go. I chose to leverage ATT&CK for us, to give us that language to help us improve. Like, that's what we did. And the point is, if you stay in the matrix, you'll fall behind in terms of innovation, adversaries, adding new things. Things that get added to ATT&CK take time. Models take time to update. Standards take time to update. Remember, not everything is in the language or whatever model you're looking at. So don't let that drive you. You drive it. Feed back to the community. Give back as you find new things. Add them. And that's the goal behind this. And the big thing is, make it work for you. Don't rely on it. Make it work for you. Help improve. Drive the community forward, and escape that matrix. And then number 5, essentially, is forgetting the fundamentals. So as we mapped to ATT&CK and operationalized it, we spent 1.5 years really driving this through. And the big thing is, along the way, you get sucked into focusing on ATT&CK and focusing on detection and response. But security is much broader than that. There's tons of fundamentals. These are just a few of the many. But essentially, the point is, don't forget about them. Continue to drive what's most important to you and your organization, and drive things forward. Leverage ATT&CK where it makes sense. Don't try to fit it into everything. It will fit where it fits, and you'll get great results from that. But again, the point is, find out what the most important aspect for you and your team, your organization, whether you're a detection team, whether you're on infrastructure, compliance, whatever. Find that most important thing, execute on it, move on to the next most important thing, and just make security better as a whole. Questions?
Well, thank you. So we have plenty of time for questions. So we have the throw mic, and I assume we have the throw mic. Over there. New battery. Or just go up to the microphone. Thanks.
So going back to your first pitfall,
Yeah.
do you have any suggestions in terms of finding what's specific to an organization? Did it grunt work of looking at 223 techniques and going one by one, or did you find an easier way to kind of categorize, to risk rank them somehow to say, this is how I'm going to tackle these? So
for us, we focused on our historic detections. So what we were seeing used most, we started there, and then we went down that list essentially. And then in terms of if you're trying to, so that was for mapping, and then for building new things, the way we prioritize is based on a couple things. We try to assign, like, if something we've seen in the wild, we give it a higher likelihood of it being used. Depending on what it is, if there's a high impact, we'll tackle that first. We don't like to use ATT&CK to drive each idea. We essentially find all of our ideas, whether we get them from ATT&CK or not. We assign that likelihood or that impact rating, and we prioritize that way. And then we just kind of continuously feed new detectors out.
Okay, thanks.
Do we have other questions over there?
Yeah, I had a question about your third pitfall, misunderstanding coverage.
Yeah.
I fully understand what you mean. There's a galaxy behind all these doors, but I would imagine that leadership would like to understand when are we done? When do we do enough? And they like, I think, KPIs that tell when are you at 100%. So have you had to deal with remarks or questions from your leadership like this?
I have. And the reality is there is no end. There is no 100% coverage. There never will be. You have to find that point on each technique or on whatever it is you're working on to find that point at which there's diminishing returns. You can get coverage up to a certain percent, and then it'll cost you like X amount to add that like final 1%. And at that point, you have to make a decision, based on you and your business, whether it's important to go that extra mile or call it for that and then add more on other areas.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. This may be a little long-winded, or at least it needs a little bit of a lead-up for me to explain the question. So in the way that you broke out the matrix into alertable, contextual, and forensic, it seems to me that one of the problems that we may face with the framework itself is that it continues to grow. And in the earlier version of the framework, there was a simplicity in it that made it easier to absorb and understand. In fact, you could literally put it on a single page. Today, I don't think you can put it on a single page. The question really goes to you as well as to the rest of the ATT&CK team, which is, I don't think we actually want it to grow in the current format because it will start getting overwhelming to the point where it may resemble something like KPEC, which is very hard to grasp because it's so big. Would we want to consider, and this is a question really for the community, would we want to consider having the ATT&CK framework be focused on one of those elements, whether it's the alerting, contextual, or forensic, and then if there's a deeper pit behind it, be able to capture that in a different framework or different construct. And the reason why I say this is I think there is, to contrast your statement earlier, I think there is a limit that we want to create here. And that limit is based on where we can establish visibility. Once you establish visibility, or rather, if we look at the ATT&CK framework as a list of vectors, attack vectors, then the question that's asked is, do I have visibility into those vectors? An attacker can attempt various types of exploits with that vector. So for example, PowerShell is a vector. There's any number of different exploits within PowerShell, right? And we would then look at ways that we can use signature-based or behavioral-based ways to detect specific exploits, but attackers will continually come up with new evasions, right? So that's an endless well, but we don't want to represent that in the framework because it will be endless. But we do want to capture something like PowerShell because that's bounded. So the question is, again, do we want to consider, how do we want to bound the ATT&CK framework? Because I think what you're pointing out is that it could, if we don't carefully understand what we're representing in there, it could end up being an unbounded matrix, which I don't think will serve any of us.
I agree on that standpoint. And the way I like to think about it, and this is just kind of how I think about it, is I like to use it as that taxonomy where we can have those bounds. But I also approach it from the understanding that there is a lot of depth to each of the different ones, and it allows us to explain to each other and have that conversation about those tactics and techniques and those implementations without going into this endless matrix. So I think there is a limit, but I don't think there's a limit to what you would consider coverage.
I was just going to ask Blake if he wanted to weigh in on this at all.
Yeah, Sunil is always good for very deep questions. So I think there are things that we can do to help control the growth of ATT&CK as it is now. And I mentioned the idea for sub-techniques yesterday, and I think that will help some of the abstraction issues right now so that we're not describing very atomic techniques sort of at the main technique level. So I think that will help a little bit. And I think over time, we'll maybe have to consider some new ideas on how to mitigate growth. But it is something we're very concerned with. We are looking into ways to help with that.
Thank you. Other questions? There.
Thanks for the presentation. Actually, I share a lot of the pitfalls that you share. I want to add one, but I want to get your opinion on something like, how do you map machine learning-based detection? Because I made a joke that machine learning doesn't know attack framework. In the sense, you can have detection that are based on prevalence, profile, classifier. They don't know anything about attacks, but they still detect things. And how do you map this type of detection to?
Yeah, so we had a similar problem, not with machine learning, but a lot of our behavioral detections are not just on adversarial behavior, they're on just abnormalities with system behavior, like forensic artifacts. So a lot of those are just abnormalities with the system, and they don't really map to some of the techniques specifically. What we did is we just kind of internally created our own labels for some of those and tried to define them internally, and then where they fit with ATT&CK, we shared them back with MITRE. But it's again, not all models are perfect. They don't cover everything, and you just have to use them where they fit and make it work for you.
Other questions? So I had one. So I was really interested in looking at your presentation because obviously we're all super gung-ho about ATT&CK, but I think we all recognize that there are opportunities for improvement. And so which of, some of the things you talked about are just realities. There's probably not anything we can do as a community except work around them. But if you had to give us, because we have the core ATT&CK R&D team, or most of it sitting here in the front row, what would be the 3 areas you'd want us to focus on? Maybe some of them have been mentioned before, maybe they haven't.
Yeah. I think
that we could change, or that we should consider changing in concert with the community.
Right. I think the biggest thing off the top of my head is definitely like sub techniques and having consistency. So back to that point 1, there's a lot of inconsistency in the scope and scale of things. So if we can be more consistent and then have the sub layers for that in an easy to leverage way, I think that'll improve a lot of the usability and kind of inconsistencies, and that may lead to us being able to potentially have better measurement and understanding of measurement and be able to explain that. And then
you don't have to do.
Yeah, I don't know 3. I mean, that's like the biggest one that I've always talked about.
And so sort of to take a look at that, and would you be up to like a refactoring, so like some techniques actually get folded into others and become sub techniques under others? And I'm making this stuff up, and Blake's
that's definitely an option. I think it comes to like all of us as a community to kind of figure that out and work with MITRE to do that. But yeah, I think there's definitely some play there, and we just have to figure out what that is.
I'm just going to ask the folks here. So by show of hands, who here thinks that there's too much unevenness and abstraction in the model at the moment? I would say that is a majority. And I'm raising my hand. Yeah, they're raising their hands. So that's great. There's a point. We have a question over there. There's a real important point, which is we're not done with ATT&CK as MITRE, as a community, and as you said, we probably will never be done. So this is about this dialogue. Blake loves to hear how much people, love attack and chase them in the mall. But, this really is about providing that continuous feedback. Question?
So when I explain the attack framework to people, I explain it as the tactic is the why would an attacker want to do this. The technique is the what is a person actually doing in order to achieve that how. And then sub-techniques or procedures would be the actual mechanism that they're implementing it. It's the how they are doing what they're doing in order to accomplish their why. And I think that there is some degree of divergence in that within the existing matrix, and that causes some confusion. Because there is a differentiation between how someone does it and an indicator. And there's been this temptation to conflate the two because of that disparity in the framework. When I try to apply this across all things, like, for example, PowerShell, not every TTP in the attack matrix has an implicit procedure associated with it. So when I hit those cases where there's not an implicit procedure, that's where things break. So I almost feel like the matrix needs to move up to a point where nothing that's in the matrix has an implicit procedure, that those things are the value of sub-techniques, and that many of the things that don't have an implicit procedure could be consolidated under another more descriptive category, or a what, if you will.
I agree perfectly with that. Like there is definitely a need for more examples in terms of some of the techniques, and then some definitely can either be expanded out or rolled up together.
So we have a question over here, and then we have a question in the back.
Ooh, that was fun. I was also in the NFL. I don't like to brag about it. First off, absolutely love the talk. It's something that I see a lot of people, they think the attack framework will be an easy button for their defenses. It's obviously not. So I'm going to throw this more back to you. Since you do consulting for firms, you've been around. Can you give us some of the stories from the field for what you've seen people have implemented the worst? No names, obviously. No names and shames. Just where are you getting this data from? Just kind of go into some of the stories behind that.
Yeah. So a lot of it comes from just experience from prior consulting engagements, and then being able to at Red Canary, we see Brian told me earlier, is 100 terabytes a day of endpoint data. And then we work with our customers in that regard when we find things and just have conversations with them about attack and whatever they're doing in their security program to kind of get their stories as well. And I think like the worst implementation, there's really not a worst, it's just kind of if you're not familiar with using a taxonomy or model or languages like attack, you could fall for the trap of thinking it's and maybe it's because it's in the shape of a periodic table or a matrix. So if you treat it like a periodic table, each thing's its own individual element. But if you look at it like a number of people have is they treat it like this a ruler or a measurement tool. And that's not what it is. And I think that's where the conversation kind of breaks down sometimes, and that's where we kind of direct that.
Question in the back.
Yeah, I can't hear. Okay. Too close. So we've been using the attack framework since about May last year in our operations, and just wanted to weigh in on the behaviors that are in attack. And it's been a great way for us to identify, the actions that an attacker, uses as they progress through the attack, and being able to focus on the behaviors in writing detection that correlate a sequence of behaviors. So you were using PowerShell, for example. So we may have an execution tactic, or excuse me, from the installation tactic, we may choose a technique with that. We may incorporate scripting with PowerShell technique. We may also include credential access or dumping, along with some other techniques, and we all correlate that as a series of behaviors, and then when it comes to writing detection, we look for that set of behaviors to occur within a certain time frame. And in that approach, it's worked very well. And based on how the attack framework has progressed, I don't think it's going to get squirrely or get out of hand. There are certainly quite a bit of techniques that have been developed, but every one that I've seen has fit so far from a detection standpoint and from a language standpoint. Comments?
No, I mean, so that's one definitely great way to approach it is to apply the different techniques where they fit, regardless of what your detection technique is specific for. And I think that's the kind of key point about a language or taxonomy that I like to stress is like you use that language where it matters, and less so of like treating each thing individually. And the way I like to allude to that is like as a snowboard instructor, we have a common language between instructors where we talk about the fundamental movements of a snowboard. We all speak that language when I'm talking to other instructors, but I don't speak that language to children. I distill that down to them. But essentially, having that language helps with that aspect, and I think this is super important for our industry as we grow and expand and build that corpus.
So you touched on this a little earlier, but I wanted to ask kind of for clarification since your presentation is about pitfalls for applying attack.
Yeah.
Attack is a language that is fundamentally designed to describe the activities of attackers. Do you see pitfalls in the current trend to attempt to ascribe attack or use attack to describe defensive capabilities or coverage?
I think that it applies to I think it applies to that describing of attackers fairly well. I think there are aspects of defense that go beyond that, and I'd like to see, like I think Blake mentioned earlier, additional additions to attack, for other aspects of security that are not covered in the current matrix, whether that's cloud or mobile or insider or there's tons of other things. And I think that as we grow as a community and expand upon that knowledge and corpus of that language, everything will start to come into play.
Any final questions? All right. If not, please join me in thanking Kyle.